Isabella had another family before she met Fabian. With her first spouse, they lived soul to soul for several years, until he had problems with his job. Frank, as his wife put it, was playing businessman. When Isabella left him, Frank was left alone with the dying business and debts. Their relationship was fractured, and neither of them were willing to save it. Frank just wasn't up to it, and Isabella didn't want to do it alone, or not at all. She met Fabian almost immediately after the divorce. The man wooed her handsomely, gave her gifts, and came over to her whenever she sounded sad on the phone. She liked everything about Fabian, except for the fact that he had an ex-wife and a daughter, on whom he spent a lot of time and money. Fabian felt it was his duty not to abandon them, even though they were no longer a family. He dedicated at least one weekend to his daughter, which annoyed Isabella greatly. She wanted Fabian's undivided attention at all times. On the days that Fabian set aside for communication with his child, he didn't even answer Isabella's calls. He would then apologize and try to make it up to her with gifts and flowers. 6 months later, Fabian proposed to Isabella and she immediately said yes. After the unsuccessful prank, Fabian seemed to be the winner in Isabella's eyes. She desperately wanted to have a baby with him, believing that it would make him forget about his ex-wife and daughter. However, her attempts to get pregnant were unsuccessful for 6 years. Isabella felt that Fabian was indifferent to her struggles, and their family was plagued with frequent arguments. Fabian would get angry at her false accusations, and Isabella would become hysterical. "I am trying for us. I want us to be a real family," she would yell at him. "We are a real family already, honey," her husband would try to reason with her. With her strong desire to have a baby in mind, Isabella came up with various ideas on how to make it happen. After some thought, she realized that she could use the help of another man. She thought of all the men she knew, and her choice fell on her ex-husband, Frank. Isabella had been keeping tabs on Frank's life since their divorce, and knew that he had successfully overcome the crisis she had left him in. He had even built a successful business that was bringing in a good income. With full confidence that her ex-husband would agree to meet her, Isabella called him and received a positive response. She had a specific goal in mind, but she didn't mention it at first to avoid scaring him off. When she went to the restaurant where she and Frank had agreed to meet, a fancy man stood in front of her. He was nothing like the tortured Frank she had left years before. Now it was as if there was a beautiful stranger in front of her, and new yet unexplored feelings came over Isabella. The former spouses talked all evening without interruption. It was as if all those years of separation had never happened. And after that day, they began to correspond constantly on social networking sites. Isabella was flattered by her first husband's attention. She was very pleased that Frank felt something for her. The desire to have a baby with Fabian suddenly took a back seat. Isabella was carried away by communication with her former lover in secret from her current husband. She met Frank and they spent time together. Fabian noticed a sudden change in his wife's behavior, and he thought it was quite strange. One night at dinner, he struck up a conversation that gradually led to the subject of the child. "Darling," the man asked softly, "did you go to the doctor?" Isabella suddenly woke up and opened her eyes wide. "Eh? Yes, no," she answered confusedly. "Why? Has something happened?" Calmly, her husband continued. Her wife slurred and tried to explain the reason why she had suddenly forgotten to go to the doctor, whom she had been seeing with enviable regularity for the past 6 years. The only thing Fabian understood from her speech was that they had agreed to meet less often now to give Isabella a chance to let go of the situation and live without constantly chasing a child. The man nodded slowly in response and saw his wife exhale and relax. Fabian frowned but said nothing more. Once, at a meeting with friends, the man shared his thoughts about his wife. He was very concerned about the abrupt change in behavior, and he could no longer digest it alone. "Look," one of the friends said, "lest she bring even a hint, you'll bring up someone else later." At first, Fabian rushed to his wife's defense, trying to prove that she would never do that, but suddenly he realized that he didn't really think so. He was really terrified of the idea that Isabella had someone. He loved his wife and didn't want to lose her, Fabian apologized to his friends and left the bar. He flicked his lighter and took a drag with pleasure. Smoke enveloped his lungs. A door opened behind him, and one of his friends, Garrick, came out behind him. "Look, I don't want to pry into your soul, but if you need it, I've got the contact of a great detective." The man was surprised. "How so?" he asked. "You and Rita are the perfect couple." Garrick smiled sadly and remained silent. Fabian still nodded silently. At first, the idea of spying on his spouse took him sharply negatively, and for several days he had been struggling internally. One part of him was for it and the other was against it. He wrestled between the two, unsure of what to choose. It seemed wrong for him to undermine Isabella's trust with surveillance, but on the other hand, the thought that she might have someone else was keeping him awake. He spent an entire week in this agony until he received a call from an unknown number. The caller was a man who introduced himself as Frank. He briefly explained that he was Isabella's ex-husband and asked Fabian to meet him. "You can tell me everything over the phone." "There's no need for us to meet," Fabian said politely but firmly. "I would still insist on a personal conversation," the man replied. After some deliberation, the man agreed, and in the evening, he was already waiting for Frank in his favorite pub. Frank did not beat around the bush and started the conversation with the main topic. By that time, Isabella had already told him about her plans to have a baby, but her ex-husband didn't want to take part in it. The woman begged and pleaded with him, and he gave in, promising to think about it. But instead, he decided to tell Fabian everything out of male solidarity. Frank shrugged his shoulders. In reality, Frank was lying. He didn't do it out of solidarity with Isabella's current spouse, but because he wanted to hurt his ex-wife morally as much as she had hurt him years ago. Simply put, he dreamed of revenge. The men talked for a long time and came to the conclusion that they needed to teach the cheater a lesson. After discussing how best to do so, they said goodbye and Frank left. Fabian, on the other hand, stayed in the pub until he was drunk out of his mind, after which he, too, went home. Frank invited his mistress out of town to his dacha. He had bought the cottage after the divorce, and Isabella had never been there. She, of course, agreed. The woman did not know that she was going to have a fateful meeting there. On the way, Frank said that he had thought about Isabella's proposal for a child, but that joyful star and drove all the way to the summer house with a blissful smile on her face. There was nothing to indicate that anyone was waiting for them at the house, so Isabella calmly followed her ex-husband down the path. Isabella walked around the first floor and admiringly praised her first husband's taste. She liked the house. With each passing day, she regretted more and more that she had once left Frank. When her lover dragged her to the second floor with him, purring in her ear that something very unforgettable was waiting for her, Isabella had goosebumps running down her spine. Frank opened the door to the bedroom and drew the woman in. The woman ran after him. Suddenly she cried out. There was someone sitting in a chair in the corner. Upon closer inspection, she realized it wasn't just anyone. It was her husband, Fabian. She opened her mouth in shock and looked from one man to the other. Traitors! She roared and threw her fists at her lover. He gave her a gentle shove, and she landed on the bed with all her might. The deceitful woman wept bitterly. The men were silent. The silence was interrupted by Frank. "Did you really think I would let you push me around so easily? After what you did, every word he said hurt Isabella deeply. You don't deserve to be happy." "Fabian, tell them it wasn't my fault." Through her tears, Isabella told her husband, but Fabian showed no remorse on his face. He looked at the woman he once loved with hatred and disgust, unable to understand how he had not noticed the snake that had been living in his chest all this time. After their second divorce, Isabella had to temporarily move in with a friend. Both Frank and Fabian cut off all contact with her. The second husband communicated with her exclusively through a lawyer, wanting nothing to do with the adulteress. This hurt Isabella deeply. She sincerely did not understand why this was happening. All she wanted was to have a real family. In order to forget the pain and humiliation she had experienced, Isabella turned to alcohol. She drank until she could no longer remember, waking up in the arms of different men in apartments she couldn't recall how she got to. For a long time, Isabella tried to recover from her divorce, but it was out of her control. The next story will surprise you even more. The way her husband avenged her adultery will shock you. Ted and Sabrina had been together for 6 years, 3 of which were spent married. Even before their relationship, Ted had taken out a mortgage on a nice one-bedroom apartment in a good part of town, with the goal of starting a family right away. He had always been ready for a serious relationship and was not interested in other people's girlfriends. It was to this apartment that he invited Sabrina. Both spouses were working. Ted had a standard 5-day work schedule in the office, while his wife worked on a shift schedule at a beauty salon. One day, on their shared day off, the couple planned to go for a walk in the park. As Sabrina was getting ready in the hallway, she received a call. After looking at the screen, Ted excused himself and went to another room to talk. After about 5 minutes, he returned with a frown. Victor called. He's in trouble again. He's coming over for a couple of days to take care of some business in town. You don't mind, do you? The wife wasn't too happy, but she didn't say anything against it. Because this kind of talk about Ted's own brother almost always ended in an argument. His wife always felt that there was no need to help Victor, because he himself never bothered about his younger brother and did not offer his help, even when it was not superfluous. Ted was good to his older brother, helping him when he was going through difficult situations, even though he didn't even ask him for it. But Victor himself did not show much reciprocity. The fact is that Victor was an adopted child in their family. The parents had already despaired in unsuccessful attempts to have a child, so they decided to take the baby from an orphanage. When Victor was 5, his mother unexpectedly became pregnant. It was a huge blessing for the parents, but not for the little son. When Mom gave birth, the parents surrounded their own son with all their attention and care. At times not paying proper attention to Victor, he began to compete with Ted, when the latter could not even speak yet. It seemed to Victor that his parents did not treat their 2 sons equally, not with equal affection. It seemed to him that Ted was loved more. He was praised more often for his grades at school, sometimes even held up as an example to the sedentary Victor, which annoyed him a great deal. Any success of his younger brother was met with envy by the older ones. As they grew older, this trend continued. Within a week, Victor came to visit them. According to him, his business in the city would only take a few days, and he assured them that he wouldn't be a bother for long. At first sight, Sabrina even liked Victor very much. In person, she no longer felt the dislike she had felt for him after her husband's stories. He turned out to be an interesting conversationalist, sharing stories about his fascinating life. Sabrina didn't even want to interrupt him at such moments. A couple of days passed quietly into the week, and Victor showed no signs of leaving. Sabrina, who occasionally stayed home on her days off, began to see Victor in a different light. He no longer seemed so bad to her. One day, when Ted went to another city for work and his wife had a day off, which she lazily spent without much planning, Victor suggested that they rent a car and go for a walk in the suburbs. Sabrina gladly agreed. It was a hot summer, and the air conditioning in the car was not working, but they still enjoyed their time together. At one point, they drove past a beautiful beach by a lake and shared a moment of connection. Victor saw an approving smile on his companion's face and turned toward the body of water. Sabrina herself didn't know how it happened, but as they went swimming together and then began to jokingly splash each other with water, they ended up getting too close. With a quick glance, they both threw themselves at each other and shared a passionate kiss. However, Sabrina quickly pulled away and got out of the water, feeling scared and confused by the sudden tension between them. On the way back, she drove in silence, unsure of how to act around Victor. She decided to spend the next day with her friends at their favorite cafe, instead of staying at home. In the morning, she got ready and left the house without saying a word to Victor. She texted her husband on the way to her friend's house and told him, "I love you very much." She still felt guilty about the kiss with his brother. Later in the afternoon, she returned home to find Victor not there. She quietly went to the kitchen for a drink of water, and then decided to freshen up in the shower while she was alone. But about 10 minutes later, as she was coming out of the shower, Victor arrived home from the gym. Sabrina quickly went to her room to get dressed, not wanting to be caught in just a towel in front of him. She put on a dress and started to leave the room, but Victor was standing at the threshold of the bedroom, as if he was going to knock on her door. "Sabrina, I think we need to talk," he said, looking into her eyes and gently placing his hand on her shoulder. She couldn't remember what he said next, as she was lost in the moment when he touched her again. He noticed this and knew his plan had worked. From there, it was much easier. They ended up sharing another intimate moment on the matrimonial bed and talked for a long time afterwards. Sabrina tried to suppress her feelings of guilt and shame towards her husband, but she couldn't deny how good she felt with Victor. "Will you say something about us, Ted?" Victor broke the silence. Sabrina snapped out of her thoughts and frowned. "Does he have to know about us?" She responded with a question. "Sooner or later, he will find out," Victor replied mysteriously, as he pulled the sheet, covering him lower. They didn't know it yet, but Ted didn't need anyone else's confession to find out about their affair. After all, even before the trip, he had installed the listening device in his and his wife's bedroom, just in case. He thought then, but in fact, deep down he was very worried about Victor being left alone in his house with Sabrina. It was as if he sensed that something bad might happen, and his premonition did not let him down. It was only a matter of time before he listened to the tape of what had just happened between his wife and his brother. Ted was returning home with a heavy heart. Sure enough, he had listened to everything the device had managed to record that day, all of his worst fears confirmed, and he walked into the apartment as if it were not his home. Sabrina was still at work and Victor was surprisingly not home. He was gone after all. Ted muttered to himself and cursed at his brother. He did not call him. He knew perfectly well that Victor was just waiting to gloat. "What a fool I was," the man thought gloomily as he took his wife's suitcase out of the closet. All his attempts to get a response from her were met with silence. "That's why he got a knife in the back." Ted carefully gathered his wife's belongings so that nothing in the house would remind him of her, and packed everything into bags. He had to hurry. He wanted to take all the things directly to her workplace. The husband drove to the salon where Sabrina worked, got a few large bags out of the trunk of his car, and went to the front desk. It was clear from his wife's reaction that she had not expected to see him there, and she was visibly flustered by his appearance. But when his gaze fell on the familiar suitcase, which she usually only took out before vacations, the smile disappeared from her face. "Ted, why did you bring my suitcase here?" she asked in surprise. "You and I don't live together anymore, and I'm about to file for divorce, so that you can continue your affairs with peace of mind." Ted answered loudly enough for the other visitors in the salon to hear. Sabrina looked at her husband in shock, grabbed him by the elbow, and tried to pull him towards the exit. "What are you talking about?" she hissed. "Don't be ridiculous. I have a tape of what you and Victor were doing there," Ted said seriously. "So I won't see you in my house again," he added, and headed for the exit. Sabrina realized that there was no point in denying it or burying her head in the sand. And the last phrase offended her so much that she blurted it out in revenge. "You know, Victor is at least a passionate lover in bed, unlike you. You don't have to pretend." Ted didn't even turn around, which only made her angrier. "I'll go to him. He's better than you at everything." "You mediocrity," she shouted. "Try if you can find him now." Calmly, the man replied and got into his car. Unlike Sabrina, Ted knew his brother well, for they had grown up together. Usually when Victor had done something wrong, he would disappear, and no one could find him for a long time. When he was a kid, everything was usually solved much faster. He would usually hide out with one of his friends, but now the situation was different. He lived in another city and was independent enough not to report to anyone exactly where he was. That's how it happened. Sabrina called him to no avail, to let him know that Ted was no longer a hindrance to their relationship and that she wanted to continue their passionate connection. At some point, it dawned on her that she was just another attempt by the hurt boy to hurt her younger brother more painfully. The realization of this difficult divorce and the need to find a new place to live and a new partner drove the woman into despair. But nothing could be undone. She should have thought earlier about the consequences of her actions and where they might lead. That's the story. Share in the comments what you think about this situation and the behavior of the characters.